If you're among the millions of Americans age 65 or above who still get behind the wheel, this message is aimed directly at you. Licensing requirements are shifting heading into 2026, and the pace of those shifts is not uniform across the country. 5 updates have quietly taken hold nationwide that could drain hundreds of dollars from your wallet and put your driving privileges at risk before anyone ever warns you. This isn't a future concern. These changes are already active today in the very state where you live and drive. The reason so many older adults are being caught off guard has nothing to do with being irresponsible. It comes down to one simple fact. No one bothered to let you know the rules had changed. That's precisely why so many experienced drivers get hit with surprises they never saw coming. These 5 specific updates deserve your full attention before your next renewal notice lands in your mailbox. The final one especially has a way of quietly stripping people of their licenses without any obvious warning beforehand. But this isn't entirely grim news. One of these updates actually streamlines the renewal process for a large portion of older drivers, including a method that lets you take care of everything without ever stepping foot inside a DMV location. Before we get into the substance, let's clear the air on the misinformation, because there's plenty of it floating around right now. There is no newly enacted federal legislation revoking licenses from everyone who has crossed the age of 70. If you've come across social media posts claiming that Washington recently pushed through a sweeping national policy targeting senior drivers, those posts are simply wrong. Either the person sharing them misunderstood something they read, or the content was deliberately crafted to frighten people into spreading it further. In the United States, driver licensing authority rests entirely with individual states, not with the federal government. That's actually worth appreciating because it means no single blanket rule applies uniformly to every driver across the board. It also explains why the overall picture appears a bit scattered and inconsistent. Requirements genuinely differ from one state to the next, sometimes significantly. While certain states are introducing additional requirements this year, others are actually scaling theirs back. Let's walk through what's genuinely happening, one point at a time. I won't claim to be an authority on this subject, but on this channel, every single week, I focus on the real financial and practical information that directly affects older adults, the rules that are evolving, the protections you may already be entitled to, and the concrete steps that genuinely move the needle. This is exactly the type of content you'll find here week after week, and missing an episode could mean missing something important. If this is the kind of information that matters to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. Now let's get into the substance. There's one more point worth addressing briefly before we move forward, because it touches on the federal level and applies to every driver in the country, not exclusively older ones. That topic is Real ID. This isn't a rule about driving, it's a national identification standard. Full enforcement is now active across all 50 states, which means that a standard driver's license lacking the required star symbol in the corner is no longer sufficient on its own to pass through TSA screening at an airport for a domestic trip or to enter certain federal facilities. If your license doesn't display that gold or black star, you can still rely on a valid passport, a passport card, or another form of federally recognized identification as an alternative. You don't need to carry both. Obtaining a Real ID compliant license requires an in-person trip to your state's motor vehicle office, along with documentation proving your identity, your social security number, and 2 separate documents confirming your current home address. Because this particular update cannot be completed by mail or through an online portal regardless of your age, it's worth pulling your license out right now and taking a look, since a good number of people, seniors included, are already carrying a compliant card without realizing it. One additional note worth keeping in your back pocket throughout all of this. Even when a license isn't fully suspended, many states have the authority to issue a restricted license instead, limiting a driver to daytime hours, specific roads, or requiring corrective lenses while driving. This allows you to preserve some level of independence even if a review surfaces a concern. Update 1 involves vision screening during the renewal process. This is the change that trips up the greatest number of people, largely because it tends to feel like a routine formality right up until you're unexpectedly standing in front of an eye chart you had no idea was coming. Most states have already incorporated some form of visual screening into the license renewal process, and a number of them begin applying it once a driver reaches their mid-60s. Arizona illustrates this clearly. Once you turn 65, every renewal from that point forward must be handled in person on a 5-year schedule, and a vision check is included each time. Other states set the bar later. Florida, for instance, doesn't add a vision requirement until a driver reaches age 80. The real hazard here usually isn't the eye exam itself. It's not being aware it's part of the process at all. Consider someone who has been renewing their license the same exact way for the past 2 decades. She walks into the office expecting nothing more than a quick photo update, and instead an eye chart is placed in front of her on a day she was entirely unprepared for. If she doesn't meet the standard, she doesn't walk out with a clean renewal. She walks out with a restriction noted on her license, a referral document, or a short-term permit, and a follow-up visit to arrange. The solution here is simple and straightforward. Find out whether your state requires a vision screening at your current age, and schedule an eye appointment on your own terms beforehand so you already know where you stand before you ever sit down at the licensing counter. Update 2 involves a growing number of states phasing out online renewal options for drivers past a specific age threshold. For quite a long time, many drivers could renew their licenses either online or through the Postal Service without any need to visit an office in person. That convenience quietly disappears in several states once a driver crosses a designated age marker. Arizona again draws that line at 65. Other states push it into the 70s before making an in-person visit mandatory. The reasoning is practical enough. An in-person appointment allows staff to run a vision screening, capture a current photo, and sometimes gauge in a general way whether a driver appears alert and physically steady. For the majority of people, this simply means scheduling an extra errand, not navigating a serious obstacle. The real danger lies in assuming that nothing has changed since your last renewal. Picture a driver who has always renewed his license with just a few clicks online. He attempts the same process again, keeps running into an error message, assumes there's a technical glitch somewhere, and sets the issue aside. Weeks pass. He eventually learns that his state now mandates an in-person appearance, and by that point, his license has already lapsed. An expired license is not a minor paperwork inconvenience. The moment it runs out, you are no longer legally permitted to drive in most states, which can directly affect your auto insurance coverage and transform a routine traffic stop into a formal citation with real consequences. The practical takeaway is this: the moment you confirm that an in-person visit is required, schedule that appointment well ahead of your deadline, not after you've already let it slip by. Update 3 concerns renewal cycles that are becoming shorter as drivers age, which means you'll be navigating this process far more frequently than you used to. When you were younger, your license may have remained valid for 8, 10, or even 12 years at a stretch, long enough that the licensing office barely registered as a recurring part of life. That window narrows noticeably for many older drivers. Arizona cuts the cycle to 5 years beginning at age 65. Texas shifts drivers to a 2-year cycle once they reach 85. Illinois requires renewal every 2 years from age 81 through 86, then moves to an annual schedule once a driver turns 87. Florida shortens its own cycle to 6 years beginning at age 80. Here's why this is relevant to you right now. Every time your renewal interval shrinks, the vision exam and any in-person requirements return along with it. A license that held for a full decade meant facing all of this once every 10 years. A license that renews every year or every other year means you're sitting across from that counter on a much more regular basis. And every single visit represents another opportunity for something to be missed if you haven't prepared for it. There's also a quieter risk tucked inside this one. When renewals were spaced a decade apart, it was genuinely easy to forget about them without any real consequence. When they occur annually or every other year in your late 80s, the likelihood that one of those dates quietly slips past you increases with every cycle. So take your actual license out of your wallet right now, look at the expiration date printed on it, and put that date somewhere visible in your daily environment, because these gaps are shrinking at exactly the same moment that the requirements connected to them are becoming more demanding. Here's the part that provides some genuine encouragement. Update 4 covers the fact that several states are actively making the renewal process more manageable for older drivers rather than more burdensome, provided you know the one step that unlocks it. In a number of states that would ordinarily require you to appear in person for a vision screening, you can skip that office trip entirely if your own optometrist or ophthalmologist completes the state's required vision documentation in advance and submits it as part of your renewal. Florida extends this option to drivers aged 80 and older. And there's a genuinely positive development worth highlighting specifically for Illinois residents. For years, Illinois stood as the only state in the entire country that required a road test based solely on a driver's age, and that requirement kicked in at 75. Effective July 1st, 2026, that age threshold has been raised all the way to 87, representing a meaningful improvement for a large number of older Illinois drivers who will no longer be required to complete a road test they were fully capable of passing without issue. A handful of other states, California included, have similarly eased certain age-related testing requirements rather than adding to them. So this is not a one-sided story about restrictions multiplying across the board. Some of what's unfolding in 2026 reflects a system becoming more accessible and reasonable, as long as you know how to work with it. Here's how to put all of this to practical use immediately. Look up your own state's precise renewal age requirements, vision screening rules, and whether online renewal remains available to you at your current age. A single phone call to your state's licensing agency or a few minutes on its official website will answer all of those questions. Get your eyes examined before your renewal on a schedule you control so that an eye chart never takes you by surprise at a critical moment. Ask your eye doctor's office whether they are able to send your vision results directly to the state licensing agency, since that step is frequently what makes renewing from home a realistic option. And write down your actual renewal deadline today, because these shortening cycles mean that date is arriving faster than you'd likely assume. Now for the update, I want you to hold on to more firmly than any of the others. Update 5 addresses the medical and competency review system, the single point in this entire process where a license can shift from fully valid to restricted or suspended in what feels like almost no time at all. More states are putting in place a step where, once a driver reaches a particular age or once someone files a concern, they may be required to demonstrate that they can still safely operate a motor vehicle. This is not a distant possibility on the horizon. It is already happening in 2026. In Illinois, drivers aged 87 and older are now required to demonstrate their driving ability as a condition of renewal, with that requirement taking effect July 1st. Beyond that specific provision, most states maintain some version of a medical review or referral system through which a physician, a law enforcement officer, or in certain states, even a family member, can flag a driver for formal reassessment. Once that flag is in place, a driver may be required to complete a vision examination, a written knowledge test, a behind-the-wheel test, or a full medical evaluation before their license can remain active. Here is the aspect that blindsides even the most careful and conscientious drivers. If an official notice arrives in the mail and the deadline stated in that notice passes without any response, or if the letter is never opened at all, a license can be suspended automatically. Not because of any failed evaluation, because no one responded. That's how responsible drivers with decades of spotless records end up without a valid license. Not as a result of an accident or a failed test, but because a government envelope ended up buried under a stack of advertising flyers and store catalogs. These letters don't arrive looking particularly urgent or important. They appear to be ordinary mail, get set aside during a hectic afternoon, and vanish into a growing pile on the counter. A second notice often arrives a few weeks after the first and meets exactly the same fate. By the time anyone in the household notices something has gone wrong, the suspension has already been processed, and undoing it demands considerably more time, effort, documentation, and stress than simply opening the original letter ever would have. And in the vast majority of these situations, the person would have had very little trouble retaining their license. They simply never knew what the letter was requesting of them. So if there is one single takeaway from everything covered here that deserves a permanent place in your memory, it's this. Any piece of mail that arrives from your state's motor vehicle or driver licensing office gets opened the same day it arrives. Read completely and carefully and acted on before whatever deadline is printed inside. Don't allow an unopened envelope to be the reason you surrender the independence you've spent an entire lifetime of responsible driving to maintain. Set aside 10 minutes this week to look up your own state's current requirements. Every state licensing agency posts its renewal age thresholds, vision screening rules, and online renewal eligibility directly on its official website. And if any portion of this was helpful to you, pass it along to someone else still driving who may not yet be aware these changes are already underway. A parent, a partner, a neighbor, down the street. Drive safely and make sure you're always one step ahead of whatever arrives in that mailbox.